So I have an exam to write in about an hour and a half, and I thought it would be a fun way to study for it by making kind of a crash course in it. Got my notes. I used up an entire highlighter, and yeah, this is what we're gonna see how this goes. So tree health varies from species to species, and it begins with the genetic information it takes for that tree to achieve its maximum potential. Healthy trees also just generally don't experience a lot of stressors throughout their life. They don't get like massive hailstorms, they don't experience insect infestation, they just have a good life. But just like with people, that's really unlikely to actually happen, that this tree has a perfect life. Some tree disorders are also genetic, some are just caused by the physical environment, and then a lot are caused by other organisms interacting with a tree. So forest pathology, as its main focus is in lumber and farming, seeks to recognize tree disease, identify the cause of tree disease, and assess what can be done to minimize the impact. But first, tree structure. You've got your roots, your trunk leads into your limbs, branches, and leaves. The roots provide anchorage and support, and they collect and store water, nutrients, and minerals and send that up the tree, while the leaves photosynthesize and they get carbs and send them down the tree. And they do that through the xylem and the phloem, the structure of which kind of varies based off different classifications of tree. Generally speaking, the cambium layer is just beneath the bark, and it's what makes both of those. And it makes the phloem outside of the cambium layer, beneath the bark, and the xylem inside the cambium layer in the tree. The phloem conducts the carbohydrates made from the leaves downwards into the stem and the roots of the tree, redistributing those so that the whole tree can use it. The bark is beyond the phloem, and it's made of dead cells to protect the tree. And then the xylem is inside the cambium layer, and it conducts the water, minerals, and nutrients from the soil upwards to redistribute and store throughout the rest of the tree. There is two types of the xylem. There's the inner xylem, which would be the heartwood, which provides mostly structure, and the outer xylem, which is the sapwood, which does all the moving and storing of stuff. Now, trees that have a seed surrounded by a fruit, like an oak tree has an acorn or an apple tree has an apple, they're called angiosperms. And the xylem of these trees develop in kind of different colors throughout the different seasons of the year. In the summer, they look really dark, and in the winter, they look really light. And that's how you get those tree rings in those specific types of trees, where some don't get those rings because some of them grow kind of upwards rather than outwards. So all angiosperms are either monocots or dicots. And what differentiates a monocot and a dicot are the amount of cotyledons inside the plant, the cotyledon being kind of the embryo of the plant. And the amount of cotyledons also kind of determines how many flower components that plant has. So monocots have multiples of 3 flower components, and dicots have multiples of 4 or 5. And then there's also gymnosperms, which produce a mature seed that's kind of unenclosed, like a pine, a fir, or a spruce, where you get like a pine cone, for example, and they don't produce annular rings. They're all considered polycots, and they're all also softwoods. So, some definitions. Symptoms are interactions between the pathogen and the host. The pathogen is what causes the disease, and the host is the tree that has the disease. And then the vector is the carrier of said disease, and that can be a living thing like a bug or a nematode, we'll get to that later, or it can be a non-living thing like wind or farming equipment, something like that. So any unhealthy tree will show a reduction in its growth quality, which can fall into 4 categories. There's necrotic, which is death in any region of the plant, hypertrophy, which is excessive growth of any region, atrophy, which is reduced growth of any region, or chlorosis, which is the yellowing of green tissue due to an inability to produce chlorophyll, which is what's produced in photosynthesis. So a pathogen is considered a pathogen when there's constant association between it and a set of symptoms. So basically all of identification in forest pathology is based off of Koch's postulates, and that's kind of a method invented by Robert Koch to prove a given thing is causing a disease. So first you have to establish a constant association between an organism and a disease through observation, then isolate the organism from the host and grow it in pure culture in a lab, and then inoculate a healthy plant with the cultivated disease-causing organism and observe that host, and then re-isolate the same organism and grow it in pure culture again and make sure that it is the same thing that you thought it was in the beginning. And if the method fails at any step, it's not your guy, and you have to start again with a different thing. Disease is caused by a biotic or an abiotic agent. Basically, a biotic agent is a living thing, and an abiotic agent is a non-living thing. So you might be thinking abiotic factors, climate change. And you'd probably be right. So winter damage is a huge factor in abiotic stress. And that's because trees adapt to the area in which they live. So when there's a massive temperature change that they're not prepared for, they undergo a lot of stress. And that can even occur if the tree is moved from place to place, not just if the place changes its weather conditions. And that movement can be as little as 160 kilometers north or south, or less if there's a significant elevation change. So the big concern with winter is ice forming in the cells, because the ice disrupts the cell membrane and kills it ultimately. And winter-resistant trees have methods to defend themselves against this. They'll kind of remove water from their own cells to prevent freezing, but they need to be ready for that to happen. So they take cues from their environment to begin protecting themselves for winter. So if it happens too suddenly, they won't have time to remove the water from their cells. Fun fact, we don't really know how trees do that. Crazy. Now, sometimes there's early freeze in the fall and sometimes there's early freeze in the spring, and it's in the spring that's more dangerous because the tree is coming out of its winter mode rather than going into its winter mode. And if it's come out of its winter mode, it can't go back. So it's just completely susceptible to damage in the spring. And rapid temperature change doesn't have to be the overall temperature of the environment. It can even be the temperature difference between night and day. So sometimes you'll see damage on like the south-facing side of the tree, like dead foliage or bark, and that's because it's getting damaged by the temperature change at sunset and sunrise. Heat, on the other hand, causes stress from a lack of moisture. Sudden or intense sun exposure can cause sun scald, and that can happen in winter or summer. In the summer, it's a pretty simple situation of too much heat, but in the winter, it's thawing the cell contents that have frozen within the tree and then rapidly refreezing them when shade comes along, causing freezing damage inside the cells. And that's why trees are often wrapped in the winter. It's to prevent that direct sun exposure that can damage them. Soil is also really important for tree health. Less moisture will cause wilting, and more moisture will cause root suffocation. And the reason excess moisture causes suffocation is because it drives the oxygen out of the soil. And tree roots are injured when the oxygen level is below 10%. Then they'll stop growing completely after 3%. And oxygen at the water table, so the point in the soil where water is just resting, is only 1%. And at 1%, the tree will just die. Speaking of soil, the soil nutrients is really important. The three most important elements are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, and a nutrient imbalance will stunt the growth of the tree. However, it's very rare to see in natural forests, and that's because the forest has evolved specifically for the trees in it. The trees and the soil are symbiotically related, they feed each other, and they make each other survive together. But it can occur on plantations when a different tree is planted in the area than what is usually growing there. And then in urban environments, it can also happen because the topsoil has been cleared away, and then the really good, rich, healthy soil that the tree needs is just not there. And sometimes soil is compacted, and that also drives the oxygen out, and that's through like frequent machinery being run over it, an area nearby being recently paved, or vehicles passing by, or the soil grade being raised. Basically all human factors. So it's a very common issue in urban environments. Atmospheric pollution, by the way, is like completely under-researched. We know that in high quantities on a concentrated area over a long period of time, trees are damaged by pollution, but we don't know what the overall effect will be long-term for like massive forests. We've seen like in Sudbury or Wawa here in Ontario that trees die downwind of factories producing a lot of pollution, but we don't know like on a grand scale what pollution does to forests. Now trees can also just get injured, and that's usually human or animal caused. Injury is not a disease because it's a short-term factor that is not progressive or spreading. It's a singular event, it can be fatal, and it's most likely an abiotic factor. There is also a secret third type of disease on trees, and that's called decline disease. And I say that it's secret because it's really just a theory right now. Some scientists don't even believe in it. They think it's kind of just a way of justifying old age or the fact that we can't find a specific cause. But it's pretty widely agreed upon that it will eventually be found to be scientifically sound. It's really an interaction of three factors of disease. There's a predisposing factor, which is inherent to the location that the tree is growing. There's an inciting factor, which is a short-term aggravation that really stresses the tree. And there's a contributing factor, something long-term that kind of pushes the tree over the edge and is the nail in the coffin. Maple decline is a good example of a decline disease. It was first noticed in the 1950s or 60s in urban areas, on sugar bushes, and in roadsides. There were dead branches in the canopy of maple trees, the fall colors were coming in early, and the twigs were not growing as fast as they used to. The suspected predisposing factors of maple decline was road salt spray, impeded drainage, overtapping of trees and sugar bushes, soil compaction and poor aeration, and air pollution. The inciting factors, in theory, were drought, excessive rain, logging activities, extreme cold, and root damage from nearby roadwork. And the contributing factors were likely root rot, vascular wilts, and wood-boring insects. Treating decline disease is really expensive, and so it's usually only done in urban spaces, but if you want to do it, you should start as soon as possible. And that involves just really taking care of the tree, fertilizing it, watering it, pruning it, and diverting salty runoff from salt spray on roads. So let's get specific. Nematodes. Microscopic, weird worms. There are 4 subcategories of nematodes. We're going to focus on the plant parasitic kind that have this spear-like feeding apparatus called a stylet, which pierces plant cell walls and sucks out all the nutrients in it. So there's ectoparasites, which feed on a small amount of nutrients in the cell and then kind of move on, sticking to one area, taking a little bit of nutrients from each cell. And then there's endoparasites, which will kill the cell in one go and move on, and it penetrates deeper into the plant as it goes. They usually feed on the root system and they produce cysts in the roots, but they can attack all parts of the plant. So they access the plant through recent wounds, so any damage that's been caused in the root system by people, animals, the weather, or other environmental factors, and they release toxins into the cell that kind of break down the matter in it so that they can absorb it. Nematode presence can also cause fungal infections, but we'll get to fungus later. Now, killing and damaging the roots of a tree definitely are the main cause of disease in the plant. But they're likely not a significant problem in natural forests because, again, the forest has evolved to withstand the nematodes that also live in it. But they can also carry viruses, like tobacco ring spot virus, which is carried by dagger nematodes. And sometimes bugs carry them from plant to plant as well, and that's how they'll end up invading other parts of the plant than the root. Now, these are like millimeters at most. They're teeny tiny, and they can move like a few centimeters per year. So they need other things to carry them large distances, like machinery or other things that move around, and they only live for about 1 month. The above ground symptoms of nematodes are growth reduction, yellow foliage, wilting, early leaf drop, and just a general decline. And then below ground, there's knots, cysts, galls, root branching, stubby roots, and usually fungal rot as well. To diagnose nematode presence in a tree, the nematode itself has to be found and identified. Proof of the parasite's presence doesn't necessarily mean proof of the parasite causing a disease. There's usually, in any given environment, 200 nematodes per half liter of soil around a tree. It's when that number hits like 1,000 plus that's going to become a problem. And if it is, there are like pesticides for nematodes specifically. Now, there's also tree viruses, and we don't know much about them. What we know about them in forest pathology is kind of extrapolated from agricultural sciences. I won't get into cell structure, but they can like interact with each other or prevent others from entering a given host. So some of them need each other to survive and some of them hate each other. And they need living cells in order to survive. So they get all of their nutrients, their nucleic acid, amino acid, enzymes from the plant cells. And that kind of disrupts the plant's normal metabolic functions. It's like if you kept eating and eating and eating and there was a tapeworm inside of you also eating your food and you're like, God, I feel like I'm eating for 2 people and I don't know why. But they're typically non-lethal. Some plants are more vulnerable than others, but they're not usually the cause of death in a tree. Sometimes a tree will like die in a certain area to prevent the virus from spreading, and that's what we call like a local lesion or necrosis. They're spread usually by insects that are like biting the tree, aphids, leafhoppers, whiteflies, thrips, beetles, mites, nematodes, but also fungi, or by wounding activities or machinery. Sometimes there's no symptoms, but each virus is unique. On hardwoods, there could also be very distinct patterns of dark green, yellow, orange, and white in different patterns. But if it's symptomless, there may also be just kind of yield losses if we're in a farming situation. The ecological role of viruses, by the way, is totally unexplored. The main method of control for viruses is to control the vector of the virus. So insecticides is a really good start, but they are very expensive. Usually it's kind of the abstinence is key method, where you just want to grow trees that are resistant to the viruses local to the area. Now, bacteria is a whole other thing. They're unicellular, they're microorganisms, and they need to be seen through a light microscope. They produce disease through, my notes say, enzymatic maceration of plant cell walls and secretion of toxic substances, which basically means that they chew up what's in the plant and turn it into mush. They get in kind of the same way as viruses, through like wounds and openings in the plant, and they disrupt the thing the plant is trying to do, which is grow and live. Really anything can carry bacteria. A good example is pruning tools or splashing rain, but also like the usual insect, birds, animals, nematodes, and they reproduce through cell division. Symptoms kind of depend on what area of the plant is being affected. If it's in the leaves and the shoots, you'll see shiny and transparent leaves, but also some dead ones as well. If it's in the vascular tissues, like the xylem and the phloem, you'll see wilting, yellowing, witch's broom, which looks like this, as well as kind of increased permeability of the wood. And if it's in the stem overall, you might get some crown gall, which looks like this, and hypertrophy of the stem tissue. To identify this, you can actually look under a microscope and you can see like masses of bacteria pouring out of infected tissue, which is really cool. Can you tell I'm getting fatigued? This is a lot. Parasitic plants. Very interesting. They have a hostorium, which is kind of like a root, but it's specifically to uptake nutrients from another plant. So it penetrates the host, it aligns its own cells with the host cells and makes a bridge to transfer elements to itself. That can be carbs, sugars, nitrogenous compounds, enzymes, minerals, water, you name it. And viruses and mycoplasmas can also travel in between those two plants. Sometimes the seeds are small, there's a ton of them, and they're carried by wind, but sometimes they're also large, few in quantity, and they're carried by birds and squirrels. On contact with the host, they'll develop their hostorium, which is the intrusive organism, and sometimes they'll grow their own plant, sometimes they won't. There's a wide range of symptoms depending on the plant. You'll see hypertrophy and witch's broom, which is because the host plant is having to work harder to get the nutrients that it needs. But sometimes there's no symptoms at all. In order to diagnose a tree with a parasitic plant, that plant has to be located. You can have the theory, but you have to find the plant to prove it. Probably the most important example of a parasitic plant is the dwarf mistletoe. It's a huge threat to conifers in western forests. And they have a really interesting method of spread. When the mistletoe is ready to release its seeds, it ejects them. And they can travel like 20 to 30 feet, and they're sticky. So they stick to other nearby trees, which is when they'll then produce that root system, penetrate the tree, and take its nutrients. Other parasitic plants, though, will have their own root system, and they'll kind of grow on their own as they find a plant to parasite off of, so they are also capable of their own photosynthesis and nutrient uptake. But they don't like to do that. They like to be needy with other trees. Now, the only way to control dwarf mistletoe is clear cutting or controlled burn of the hosts. But it's such a well-researched parasite that there's a lot of rules about when and how you're supposed to do that. Now, fungi, very fun, because they can be beneficial, even to humans. We love fungi. We eat mushrooms all the time. And they also serve the critical function of breaking down organic matter, so they play a huge role in the carbon cycle. Now, there's two types of fungi. There's saprobic fungi and parasitic fungi. Saprobic decomposes cellulose and lignin residues of lifeless organic matter. So that's the kind of fungi you think about when you think about something that's died in the forest and is kind of being overtaken by the landscape. Obligate saprobes are only saprobic, but some are facultative. I don't think I'm pronouncing that right, but whatever. And those can also be parasitic. And parasitic fungi live at the expense of other organisms. They only play a minor role in forests, and even smaller, a number of those are parthenogenic. Same with saprobes. Obligate parasites are solely parasitic, and facultative parasites can also be saprobic. They are heterotrophs, so they do not produce chlorophyll. They rely on products synthesized by other organisms. And their primary needs are oxygen, warmth, and water. But there are exceptions. There are some that can grow in humidity instead of water, about 60%. And some can also produce toxic chemicals, and that's how you get spontaneous combustion in grain storage, which is fun, but doesn't really happen anymore, which is good. Most species live in temperatures from 0 to 43 degrees Celsius, but there are snow molds and thermophilic molds, which are obviously exceptions. Now, mycelial growth forms are like the most important way to recognize fungi. They're made of microscopic interwoven tubular filaments called hyphae, hypha singular, and a collection of those hyphae make the mycelia. The hyphae release enzymes that cause like a digestive reaction to the tree they're attached to. They make it soluble, which is what we think of as rot, and then they absorb it to collect the nutrients from it. Some mycelia will be internal, which develops inside the tree and is like microscopic and grows in between the cells of the substrate. And some is external, which develops on and around the substrate, and it can take multiple different forms. It's usually cobweb-like and sooty black-brown, but some are mycelial felts, which are what they sound like. They look like felt in the cracks of the host tissues. Mycelial fans, which grow between like the bark and the wood and are like a tawny fan. There's rhizomorphs, which are cord or tape-like strands of mycelium branches. They're like a network. It's how they spread to other plants as well. And there's sclerotia, which is a compact hyphae mass. It's pin or thumb sized, and it's full of food reserves. Now, mycelia grows from spores, which is the reproductive tissue of fungi. And that's a single cell or small number of cells produced by sporophores or fruiting bodies, which you may recognize as mushrooms, puffballs, or conchs, which are different types of mushrooms. Some are endogenous, which are produced inside of hyphal cells or inside of large specialized cells, or exogenous, which are produced on the ends or sides of special hyphal branches. They're microscopic. One fungus will release tons of spores and very few will survive, and they can be carried by wind. Some are sexual, requiring a mate or a union of two separate cells, but most are asexual. They come directly from the hyphae without needing to find a mate cell. They can also be carried by insects, animals, and tools, and their lifespan can be from like hours to years. There's also 3 other types of reproduction. There's fragmentation, where the hyphae break off and form a new plant. There's fission, where a cell splits into 2 and each one is capable of creating a new plant. Or there's budding, which is like a specialized outgrowth that breaks off and forms a new plant. So the fungi has a 5-step life cycle. There's inoculation, which is the physical transport of the spores to its suitable substrate or host. There's the penetration, which is the invasion of the fungus into the substrate. The infection, which is the establishment of the pathogen inside of the substrate. incubation, which is the interval between infection and the appearance of symptoms, which could be up to many years, and reproduction, when the sporophore is produced and spores are made. There's also 3 classifications of plant susceptibility. Susceptible plants will support fungus and permit its development beyond initial infection, whereas resistant plants will suppress it and not allow like a full establishment of it. And then there's immune plants, which will completely reject the fungus and there will be no invasion at all. Decay also comes in 3 stages. Stage 1 is incipient, where the wood is mainly sound in structure, but it's discolored or stayed. Intermediate decay is when the wood shows signs of breakdown, and the discoloration is, funny enough, kind of lighter in this stage. And then there's advanced, which is when the wood is broken down enough to crumble in your hands, and it's really soft or full of holes. I got a few case studies here, but I think that's it. I hope you learned something, because I did, which is really concerning, because I have to take this exam now in like 20 minutes. Wish me luck.